The United States officially entered World War II in December of 1941 after the Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Hitler declared war on the United States a few days later, and once the U.S. was actively involved in the war, American leaders agreed with their allies, the British and the Soviets, that Germany got the top priority. So the United States agreed with the Germany first strategy. The main disagreement among the big three, the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union, was exactly how to go about defeating Germany. What Stalin, the Soviet leader, wanted in 1942 or early 1943 at the latest was for the British and the Americans to cross the English Channel and invade occupied France in order to open a second front in the war against Germany. The first front, of course, being the war in the East between Germany and the Soviet Union. In the beginning, American leaders agreed with the Soviets that that should be their goal, to open a second front in 1942 or early 43. The British, however, argued for a delay. This became very controversial, especially during the Cold War following World War II, because the Soviets took the view that they basically broke the back of the German war machine, while the British and the Americans sort of piddled around and didn't really do anything significant until 1944. I think mainly the British were very concerned that if they made the cross-channel invasion before they had built up overwhelming military strength, that it might be a complete failure. The British, of course, were still haunted by memories of World War I, and eventually the British convinced the Americans to do it their way. So in 1942 and 43, the British and the Americans concentrated on the Mediterranean, first driving the Germans out of North Africa, then invading Sicily and Italy and knocking Italy out of the war. Also, the British and the Americans began a strategic bombing campaign against Germany, which, while not decisive in and of itself, did play a significant role in the ultimate victory over the Nazis. And in the meantime, the British and the Americans were building up massive military strength in the British Isles. In fact, by 1944, some said that it seemed that the British Isles might sink into the sea under the weight of all the American supplies and equipment that had been shipped into the country. And in some villages in Britain, the American population now outnumbered the British population. And of course, all of this was preparatory to finally launching the Second Front with the Normandy invasion, D-Day, on June the 6th, 1944. Once the Second Front was opened in early June of 44, the war in Europe ended less than a year later. Almost 11 months to the day, on May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered. Now, having said that is not to suggest that it was easy. In fact, most of the American casualties suffered in the war came in the 11 months between D-Day and the German surrender in May of 45. And one of the bloodiest battles in the military history of the United States, the Battle of the Bulge, was fought in December of 44 and January of 45. Nevertheless, once the Second Front was finally opened, the British and the Americans and their allies did eventually break out from the Normandy beaches and swept across Europe, liberating France and eventually pushing into Germany itself. It is true that the Soviets probably did more to defeat Germany by inflicting massive casualties on the German war machine in Eastern Europe and, of course, eventually pushing on into Germany itself. But the combined effort of the so-called Big Three, the British, the Americans, and the Soviets, did eventually bring Hitler's empire to an end. Meanwhile, the United States did have to keep sizable military forces in the Pacific to at least contain the further expansion of the Japanese empire. Particularly naval strength, the United States had to maintain a sizable force. The war against the Japanese was fought on a massive scale and involved fighting in all types of environments. Basically, there were three fronts in the war against the Japanese. One was the war on the Asian mainland itself, referred to as the CBI, Theater of Operations, for China, Burma, and India. The United States played a role in the CBI, but it was primarily logistical. Relatively few American ground combat troops fought on the Asian mainland. The brunt of the war there was borne primarily by the native peoples of the region, the Chinese, the Burmese, the Indians, and others, and by the British, who still controlled India. But the United States did make a contribution there. The second front in the war against Japan was the Southwest Pacific, based out of Australia. And there, the United States Army and Marine Corps, under the overall command of General Douglas MacArthur, as well as Allied forces, Australians, New Zealanders, and others, did slog their way through the jungles of the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, the ultimate goal being to return to the Philippines, which the Japanese had seized from the United States in early 1942. In some ways, the return to the Philippines became a personal quest for General MacArthur, who had been in command there when the Japanese invaded after Pearl Harbor. MacArthur made his way to Australia, held a press conference announcing what he had done, saying, "I came through and I shall return." And in 1944, MacArthur and his men did return to the Philippines, although it would take several months of really intense combat before the Japanese were defeated. From the American perspective, the main front in the war against Japan was the Central Pacific, which involved a so-called island hopping campaign carried out mainly by the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps. The overall commander in the Central Pacific was Admiral Chester Nimitz of the U.S. Navy. The fighting in the Central Pacific basically involved the Americans hopping from island to island and securing them from the Japanese. Many of the islands were bypassed, but beginning with Tarawa in 1943 and then moving on to the Marshall Islands and the Marianas in 1944, the Navy and the Marine Corps slowly but surely pushed the Japanese back closer to the Japanese home islands. It was generally agreed that the only way to get Japan to surrender unconditionally was to invade Japan itself. The real focus of the war in the Central Pacific was to seize islands, which could be used as air bases from which to bomb Japan, the idea being that before the invasion of Japan took place, aerial bombing could be used to soften up the Japanese defenses. In February of 1945, American Marines seized the island of Iwo Jima, and this put Japan within range of increasingly heavy bombing, conducted largely by B-29 bombers, the super fortresses, which started raining death and destruction down on the Japanese home islands. The seizure of the island of Okinawa in June of 1945 meant that all that was left was the invasion of Japan itself. In planning for the invasion of Japan, the Allied leaders were estimating casualties as high as 250 or 300,000, or in some cases much higher than that. It was generally believed that the Japanese would fight to the death, as they had generally done on all the tiny islands in the Central Pacific. And so Allied leaders, while they were quite confident that Japan could eventually be subdued, were planning on an incredibly bloody campaign to secure the Japanese home islands. Plans were underway for the first landings in Japan to take place in late 1945, and then a second landing on the main Japanese island of Honshu in early 46. This, of course, is when technology changed everything. Since before World War II started, the United States had been pursuing the so-called Manhattan Project, which was the code name for the development of an atomic weapon. Testing went on throughout the war, and in the summer of 1945, there was a successful test of an atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert. Now the President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief has to make the decision whether or not to use this awesome weapon of destruction against Japan if the Japanese did not immediately surrender. And the president who had to make this momentous decision was not Franklin Roosevelt, who had served as Commander-in-Chief during most of World War II. Roosevelt had been elected to an unprecedented fourth term in 1944, but he died just a few months into that term and was succeeded by Harry S. Truman of Missouri. Truman had only been vice president for a couple of months because he had not served as Roosevelt's vice president during his first three terms, and now it's Harry Truman who has to make the decision about whether or not to use the atomic bomb. People have agonized over this decision for Harry Truman ever since 1945, but if you take Truman at his word, and if we've ever had a president you could take at his word, it was probably Harry Truman, he didn't agonize over it much. To him, it seemed a pretty clear-cut decision. If Japan did not surrender by the deadline they were given, then we would use the atomic bomb. Anyway, Japan did not surrender, and so on August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The devastation was unprecedented in the sense that one bomb essentially wiped a city of over 100,000 people off the map. But more people actually died in the firebomb raid on Tokyo a few months earlier than died at Hiroshima. Still, we have entered a new age in human history where one bomb can essentially destroy an entire city. So it was unprecedented destruction in that sense. Still, the Japanese did not surrender, so 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, another B-29 bomber dropped another atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki with similar results. About a week later, on August 14, 1945, the Japanese finally asked for a ceasefire, and that pretty much brought an end to the fighting in World War II, although the war against Japan was not officially over until a formal surrender ceremony took place on board the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. If you consider World War II to have begun with the German invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, and ended with Japan's formal surrender on September 2, 1945, World War II lasted exactly 6 years and a day. In some ways, it had actually started earlier than 1939 in Asia. But at any rate, in those half dozen years or so, at least 50 to 60 million people died. Some estimates are higher than that. Much of the world was in ruins, and the United States in 1945 was by far the strongest nation in the world. Some say that in 1945 the United States was the strongest power in the entire history of the world.